Hey everybody, are you ready to reopen and get life back to normal? I know that I am. But what does reopening look like? We discussed that in our first video, but we're going to look at some other things that we should be looking for, planning for, and well, even what's going to be allowed. However, I want you to know that over on the Payments Professor website, there's an entire series on pandemic planning, and the attendees have been raving about the class, but they've been asking for follow-ups like this video on what are the things that should be considered for reopening. I had so many requests, they even came in through LinkedIn and YouTube as well. So we decided we're going to make these videos of that series available to all of you. Ready to reopen? Well, stay tuned. Hey everybody! In that last class, we discussed some of the preliminary procedures for reopening after or during a pandemic. That was just some of the things to consider before opening the doors. But what is going to happen when it's time to open the doors and let everybody back in? Well, again, in that last class, we ended up with the mention of controlling the flow of traffic, and that can be assisted by limiting the number of people who can enter and also where they can enter, like limiting it to one entrance. Having a designated entrance and exit for the flow of traffic and for the monitoring of who is entering and exiting can help. You see, this greatly helps so that you don't exceed occupancy. Wait, we need to know what that occupancy is. We'll get to that. You want to be able to also pre-screen your patrons, and well, I'm getting way ahead of myself. So to help monitor the number of people in the building at one time, we need to first establish the maximum occupancy for the institution or the specific areas of the location, which could include the lobby and other common areas. Remember, we started this off by having legal involved. So check with legal, and they should check with the federal, state, or local guidance to determine capacity for your location and to help with controlling occupancy. Do you need to modify or possibly stagger hours of operations to help accommodate this? Or will there be different hours for specific branches or locations, like maybe operation centers or training locations? Other questions I ask: will you offer special hours for at-risk population, or maybe even for the first responders? Consider the impact to your customers and your community when you answer those questions. I know that I've seen some locations that started limiting their hours, but this actually caused more people to have to be at the location because of the more limited time frame that the office, the service, or that location was being made available. I'd say possibly consider the opposite, maybe extending hours to spread out when account holders can make use of your services and give them more flexibility. But first, we gotta get him in the building. So what does that mean when it comes to getting him in the building? I'd ask you this: will you need to assign an employee or maybe a team to monitor and administer safety and crowd control practices? Will someone be responsible for monitoring and controlling the entrance? Will the entrance be open at all times, or will access be limited by appointment only? And maximum capacity, what's that going to look like? How's it going to be handled? Physical security, what about that? Hey, will you be taking temperatures? Don't forget social distancing. And do I need to ever escalate any of these issues? Yeah, you're going to need to have a policy and procedures for all of this in place. So for example, do you need to consider developing a temperature screening practice for visitors prior to entrance? This is actually considered to be allowed and a common practice during a pandemic. But this means you will have to have someone who is responsible to execute a temperature screening practice for visitors prior to entrance. Again, it is something that is allowed and can be considered common practice during a pandemic, but there are some risks to consider. Like, will you screen everyone or only the ones you think exhibit symptoms? My opinion, the only answer here is everyone. But when it comes to temperatures, what are the acceptable temperature readings? Again, let's go back to those federal, state, or local guidances to see. Now, how is the temperature to even be taken? Is the employee trained to properly take temperatures? And what if someone has a temperature outside of the values you have determined to be acceptable? What do you do then? Well, that then leads to the need for customer refusal guidelines. Yeah, I'm gonna have to tell you no. So do you maybe then rescan. And how long do you wait to rescan? What is the failed test action plan? Are you prepared to refer them for medical attention? What does legal say about this? And I'd also wonder, what about your insurance liability coverage? Yeah, that's something else that's got to be considered. Another important question, are you going to require the wearing a mask? We mentioned this earlier. You will definitely, at a minimum, have to account for your account holders wearing some type of facial coverings. They're just going to do it. Something that we've actually highly discouraged for years in banking. No hats, no sunglasses, etc., etc. So if you do have someone who's doing this that is stationed at your entry point, make sure they're prepared for what they're going to face. You also want to communicate and train all employees regarding the know your customer procedures that are going to be in use during this time. Will you require temporary removal of facial coverings to verify identity? How are you going to even go about looking at and, if necessary, touching their identification? I would also reinforce fraud mitigation controls and practices that they should be at an increased awareness during this time. But this security, it's something you've got to have. It's got to be in place. Another thing to consider, have you assigned an employee or a team to monitor and administer security practices? So again, let's make sure that you communicate and train appropriate team members regarding physical security requirements and those procedures. You should revisit your programs on awareness, your programs on visitor identification procedures. And that is going to include facial covering impact and most definitely robbery procedures. More of that in the next video. And what else would we need to consider? Well, the last thing I really want to cover in this section of the class is what about your staff? So you need to be aware of your account holders, but you also need to stay aware of your employees and their health. I actually see that there's going to be a need to develop employee screening measures, including possibly creating employee COVID-19 training for awareness and their expectations. Develop employee temperature screening practices if necessary and when needed. Do what is necessary to ensure confidentiality measures are also in place. As always, hey, let's get HR and legal involved. And as always, have that worst case scenario action plan in place. Nobody thought we'd be dealing with this months ago, and here we are. And in that training and that awareness for employees, be sure to provide training regarding what the COVID-19 guidelines for employees are going to be. Things like reporting symptoms, their own or someone else's. What are the symptoms to be on the lookout for? Who to report the symptoms to? Even what if they need to escalate the reporting of symptoms because it is their supervisor that they believe is showing symptoms and they're afraid to report them? Wow, all those are things that we have to consider in this new world of banking. All right, we really covered a lot in this second video in the series on reopening procedures, and there is actually more to come.